Hello, I'm Dr. Jane McCartney. I'm a psychologist and have worked in the criminal behaviour field in the UK for many years. And in these videos, I wanted to look behind the headlines of a crime, a killing, a murder, just to see exactly what was going on in the minds of the person that committed the crime. What were their motivations? What were their thoughts? What was their background? Essentially, why did they commit that crime? At this point, just before we get into the video, if I could ask you to like and subscribe, it helps the channel tremendously. Thanks. In this video, I'm going to look at Dennis Nilsen. Now, he was a serial killer in the UK. He was active, as far as the police and the courts were concerned, between 1975 and 1983, where he would kill 12 men. When he was arrested, he actually said that he had killed a lot more. But this, in the subsequent investigation, was debuked. It was kind of put to one side because, as far as the police were concerned, they had 12 men, some of whom to this day are still not identified. Nilsen would tour the gay bars of London. He would look for the dispossessed. He would look for the lonely. He would sometimes actually even pick people up off the street. His MO would be to take them back to his flat. He would then feed them. He'd allow them to clean themselves. Sometimes, with the drug users, he'd even actually facilitate their drug use. They would drink, they would listen to records together, they'd watch some television together, they would have sex quite often. But Nilsen was not finished with them. He wanted to keep them, and he would kill them. He would strangle them. He would sometimes strangle them with the cord of his record player or a tie. And then, just to make sure, he'd often drown them as well, just to make sure they were absolutely dead. Now, there was a lot said about Nilsen's competency, if you like, as a serial killer, because he didn't know literally what to do with the bodies. They were stacking up in two properties. He moved in between his killing spree and he left some evidence of the previous killings in his previous property, and then he moved to his notorious property in Muswell Hill. And he was essentially caught because he was trying to flush body parts down the drains, and somebody called a drain clearing company and they found what would be human remains, and then the police were called in. As soon as the police were called in, he tried to deny it. First of all, he kind of would say, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about." The police instantly said, the officer in charge instantly said, "Stop mucking around. Where are the bodies?" And he said instantly, "They're in the cupboard, they're under the bed, they're under the floorboards." He would say these things. So that was Nilsen. He was subsequently tried and convicted and would spend the rest of his life in prison. But what I wanted to do, as I said, is to go behind the headlines a little bit and think about exactly why Dennis Nilsen did what he did. He was born just towards the end of the Second World War. He's brought up in Scotland. Now, he had a Catholic family, but if we kind of think about Scotland, especially in those days, as being very Presbyterian, very straight-laced, very straightforward. And his mother had married a Norwegian fisherman in Scotland, but the marriage was very short-lived. He was an alcoholic. He was often away, absent a lot of the time due to his fishing. So Nilsen never had a concept of what a father was like. And then at the age of 6, they actually got divorced, which would have been quite unusual in those days, but his mother seemingly couldn't stand the situation anymore. She moved in with Nilsen and his 2 younger siblings into his maternal grandparents, her mother and father. And seemingly he was very close to his maternal grandfather. He used to go out fishing with him. And he would say, as a reason to begin with, that he killed was the trauma that he felt when he saw his grandfather who had died, and he was made to see, as was the tradition then, to see his grandfather laid out, and he was traumatised by this. But that wasn't kind of bought by various police, various doctors, and ultimately the jury when he tried to claim diminished responsibilities. But the reason that I believe that Nilsen went on his killing spree was because he was incredibly lonely. He would say about this, he had one stable relationship in his adult life, and when that broke apart, when his partner left, he said he just descended into alcoholism and loneliness. And I think that's a key point. And this is what he would do. He would be going around picking up people off the streets for their company. There was talk with Nilsen that he kept some of the corpses. He would keep them, and he would keep them for company, and he would watch television. Now, the thing about Nilsen and the stories that have gone around about him subsequently over the years is he is the only person that is giving these stories, that started these stories. They've got, of course, elaborated over the years, but it was his story. So we have to take everything with a pinch of salt. There were certainly no whole corpses found when the police did their investigation. So whether that's true or not, it will never be known. But he would talk about this abject loneliness. When he was a teenager, he would join the army, and he enjoyed his time in the army. He was in the catering corps, he travelled the world, he had comrades, and he really enjoyed the army. But the one thing about Nilsen was that he was a homosexual. He was a homosexual for obviously many years. In the army, certainly in the 60s, it was illegal. It's still an illegal act in the early 60s in the UK, and it wasn't actually decriminalised in his native Scotland until 1980. So his sexuality had with it a sense of shame, a sense of dishonour, a sense of humiliation. Everything that he was trying to get away from, he was actually taking with him all the time. And he would then just simply take it out, with a sexual aspect, of course, on his victims. He was having sex with men, which is what he wanted to do. He had to get them into a certain situation, which obviously not ideal because it's not a proper relationship. And then what do you do with them? Add to that the sense of control as well. So all serial killers are narcissists, of course, and with that becomes that sense of control and power and domination and superiority. And he was that classic narcissist that wanted both the sex, but also the domination and the control and the... He kind of, in a way, he kind of doesn't quite tick all the narcissist's box, because he could actually think about somebody. He could say, well, come back to my place and have a shower. I'll feed you. One of the odd names that he got, he was known as the Muswell Hill Strangler, but he was also known as the Kindly Killer, because he would seemingly look after these people for a very short time before he killed them. But he was welcoming them into his home just for a brief time to share their company. What type of company it was, what one can only imagine, if they were people off the streets, if they were drug addicts, if they were substance users. So he's a narcissist. He demands control, a high manipulator, no empathy towards anybody else, or very little empathy in Nilsen's case. Some, because he would feed them and bring them back and allow them to clean themselves, and sometimes facilitate their drug use. But he wanted to dominate people. And there was also some interviews with him when he was in prison, and he would talk about how he would be abusing the bodies, whether they were quite dead or dead. Again, that's only what Nilsen would say. And he would look at himself in a mirror while he was doing this. Again, with Nilsen, you have to think what he tells people to maintain the attention and what actually went on in reality, nobody will ever know. And I think even if he was making up what he was talking about, or he was kind of, adding to and making more dramatic the stuff that he was talking about, I think in his mind, he would actually believe that. So there would be no way of actually getting to the truth of what actually went on in these two properties in North London when Dennis Nilsen was on his murderous spree. So you have this combination with Nilsen of a narcissist who wants his control. You have somebody that is shameful and humiliated about his sexuality, but he still wants to have sex. So then he just takes the people that are literally there. As I said, one of the things that he would do, he would tour the gay clubs of London, looking again for the vulnerable, the lonely, the dispossessed. And if we add to Nilsen, on his arrest, his admittance to what he was doing, he suddenly got that thing that he'd been seeking for all of his life. He was looking to be somebody. He was looking to be notorious, hence saying to them, there were upward of 35 killings, or whatever it was he said. He was suddenly somebody. And in his court appearance, that's exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to be the somebody. He wanted the whole, I'm pleading not guilty, so I can have the notoriety. When it came to him leaving the court, often prisoners will have a blanket over them and they'll be shielded from the press. But he refused that. He wanted to be seen. He enjoyed the attention. When he was incarcerated, when he was in prison, he would be a complete nuisance to the authorities. He was always complaining about not getting his gay porn or not being allowed his appeals to take to the European Courts of Human Rights. Again, he was just always wanting lots and lots of attention, which he wouldn't have got when he was a youngster, remember. He was never settled. Apparently he would live with his mother and his stepfather and their subsequent children together, but also at the same time he would live with his grandparents or his grandmother. So you had this sense of never quite being settled with him as well. Never boundaries, never kind of that thing that children want, which is to know where they are and to know that they are loved, and turn that into his burgeoning sexuality as well. And from an early age, he's told that this is wrong, this is shameful, this is disgusting, this is humiliating, you shouldn't even be having these thoughts. And he has to bury that really deep inside. What went on, I've never seen any reports or read any research about any activities that he got up to in the army. Maybe they just didn't feature for him, or maybe they did and they just were never reported. But take that into civilian life. And there was an interesting thing about Nilsen was after he left the army, he'd done his time in the army, he wanted to recreate that and he joined the police. For a year, he was a serving police officer, but he would say that he didn't get on very well with the police because they knew about his sexuality and they were very homophobic. Or even if they didn't know about his sexuality, they were still very homophobic, so he didn't feel comfortable or that he belonged there. He thought he belonged in the army, but he didn't belong in the police. And when he went into civilian, he worked as a civil servant, he was a little bit more accepted. But he's always got that with him. He's got that sense of guilt, that sense of self-disgust with him about his sexuality, which he would then just transpose and take out on these vulnerable, these dispossessed, these not even looked for. There were only a few of his victims that were actually reported missing. And he would use their anonymity and their nothingness to his advantage, because who's going to miss them? Who's going to miss this drug addict that I've literally just picked up off Charing Cross Road? Because that's what he did. He would go up and down and he would look in street corners and doorways, and he would take them home with him. And who's if you're in that position, who's going to say no to that? In his civilian life, Nilsen would have various little brushes with the law. There was a situation where he was caught taking some video or some pictures of somebody when they were asleep. And when this got out, this was his work situation when he was working as a civil servant in a job centre. And when this became knowledgeable, the person actually complained to the police. They were disgusted by what he'd done. So they complained to the police, and Nilsen was spoken to by them, and then the matter seemingly was dropped. And it's always the little things. It's the little things that embolden the killers. They think, actually, there was something that I shouldn't have been doing, and I largely kind of got away with it. And add that to the huge amounts of killing that Nilsen was doing, and it's an interesting kind of pattern that the bodies that were found and were dated, there seems to be kind of some gaps in between them as well. So it's largely thought that he probably did kill more than 12 men, but there was no evidence found to suggest that there were more than 12 actually found in these two properties. So that's what he had to be tried for. So I think this sense of emboldenedness that would have come along with his killings, with his petty criminality, would have just led him on towards that path. And ultimately, as I said before, he wasn't a very good serial killer, because the bodies literally were mounting up and he just did not know what to do with them. So that was the psychopathy, the inside mind of Dennis Nilsen. He's an interesting character because I think it's just, as I say, we combine those three things, his sexuality and how he felt about that, his want for control because he's a narcissist, and also that sudden later in the day thing, that notoriety, which he really revelled in. He even did a television interview in prison. Quite how that came about, I'm not entirely sure, but there's some footage, or there's certainly some stills of him doing a television interview complaining about the lack of his books and his porn and his appeals being not allowed and the treatment that he was receiving. So he happily lapped up all the attention that he wouldn't have got. He was out, he was proud, he was a proud gay serial killer, and he wanted the world to know it. And, there's no point being this clever person, or so he thought, unless the world knows it. So he did everything possible to keep the world aware of him. So that was Dennis Nilsen, the Muswell Hill Strangler, as he's often referred to. I would ask you if you wouldn't mind subscribing and liking these videos. It helps the channel hugely, and it helps me hugely. And also, I have a corresponding podcast called Why Killers Kill, which is available on all the usual platforms. So if you'd like a little bit more in-depth detail about killers and what goes on in their mind, then I would urge you to just pop over to Apple or Google Podcasts or the usual and download some episodes of Why Killers Kill. Until next time, thanks ever so much for watching, and goodbye.